Well, welcome everybody to the Convene Studios, except we're not in the Convene Studios because of this pandemic that we're all in the middle of. John Stonestreet is my guest. He's in Colorado Springs, and I'm happily ensconced in the hills of Rancho Santa Margarita. So welcome, John.
Hey, thanks. It's great to see you, my friend. Always great to talk to you. And yeah, I mean, it's how do you compare who's better off in what state during this crisis? Because you've got weather, you've got governors making random decisions. I don't know. So I'll stay put rather than come to California at this point.
There you go. I still want to find that desert island where there's no cases of COVID-19 and a really great internet connection.
That's right, and no governor. If you can
No
get
governor.
all three of those things, yeah,
No governor.
that's like Oz. Yeah,
I
good luck with
figured
that.
out the other day you could do a $50 flight to Bermuda, but you had to quarantine in your hotel room for 14 days.
Yeah, well, yeah. Which hotel?
I don't know.
Which hotel?
So let me read this bio that you sent me. No, I'm kidding. He didn't send it to me. John, for those of you who don't know, is the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. He's a sought-after speaker on faith and culture. He leads collaborations that mobilize Christians to understand Christian worldview, and that's what we're going to talk about. He's the daily voice of BreakPoint. Some of you may listen to that, and some of you may have listened to that when it was led by Chuck Colson, a nationally syndicated commentary on culture. Reaches more than 1 million people a day. He's authored a number of books, degrees from Trinity, Evangelical, and he's in Colorado Springs. John, welcome to the broadcast.
Hey, thanks.
Yeah, and for those of you who may not have heard of Convene, we're a comprehensive leadership organization that helps leaders grow their business and themselves. And we're all the way from Rwanda to the United States, helping leaders with coaching, consulting, and peer-to-peer networking. So, John, you have been a great champion of Christian faith and culture, one of probably the leading voice of faith and culture. And sometimes Christian business leaders don't pay attention to culture. They're head down, they're trying to increase revenue, they're trying to love on their people, they're trying to make a difference. But there's this other part of life that maybe they don't pay attention to. Maybe they've compartmentalized it and said, I'm not going to protest. I'm not going to read that book. I'm not going to write my congressman. I'm not going to donate to these crazy causes like modern day slavery. All of that's wrong. What would you say would be kind of the top topics that Christian leaders should be aware of? And let's just rapid fire hit them and talk about why they matter and what we should do about it.
Yeah, well, let me first say that most business leaders who don't kind of care about those controversial issues in culture understand how important culture is in their own business, right? It's not just a matter of, it was a Drucker who said culture eats strategy for lunch every day of the week. And we could say as Christians, culture eats theology for lunch every day of the week. Wow. Our culture eats our moral behavior for lunch every day of the week. Just like you're not doing your business in a vacuum, we're not living our Christian life in a vacuum. We're living in a cultural moment, and that cultural moment assumes all kinds of things about what's true, what's good, who we are, what the good life is, what's worth living for, who's in control, all that sort of stuff. So, in certain cultures, certain issues rise to the top. And I would say fundamentally, the serious question of our culture is there such a thing as truth, and how can we know it? And that this is exacerbated both by kind of this whole history philosophy in which we've gone from being what's called a modern culture to a postmodern, or at least an ultra-modern culture. And that's philosophical speak, but a lot of us know. I mean, if you kind of think about marketing, 100 years ago, maybe not 100 years ago, let me make it a little more realistic. 50 years ago, you'd have commercials saying 9 out of 10 dentists prefer Crest, right? Because we were a culture that valued expertise. We were a culture that valued absolute scientific knowledge. There was this idea that we could know these things objectively out there and be able to process it. Now everybody knows if you're selling toothpaste, you don't sell it with dentists. You sell it with hot girls that will kiss you. And so it kind of underscores that we've moved as a culture from an objective view to a subjective view. Now, when you add into that kind of the chaos of different news, the orbits of different news sources, the difference between the Fox News world and the CNN world, living in a world of information, of memes and Facebook posts and social media and all these little nuggets of information, where look it up for some of us meant go to a book as a kid. Now it means go to Google. All of these things mean the truth is, and how to find truth is huge. The other one I'll say, and these are kind of big categories, and we can get into the specifics, like, things like abortion, religious liberty, the generational gap between boomers and Gen Z. The other one, though, is this question about what it means to be human. To me, you think, well, what does it mean to be human? Everybody agrees on that. No, they don't. The difference between Nazi ideology and others had to do with the question of identity. The differences right now in our culture between people on various sides of things like the LGBT movement is the question of identity. Not just whether a behavior is right or wrong, but what makes us who we are. What's the essential part of us we cannot change? And these are issues that have dramatic impact on Christians, certainly on our kids, but I think increasingly we're seeing it in the corporate space as well, especially for Christians who believe that their faith is not just kind of this personal private thing, but this thing to be lived out in all of their life.
Wow. So here here we sit, we're being listened to by hundreds of business leaders who their head is down and they're trying to run their company. You said something very profound at the beginning, which was CEOs work on their culture,
right,
for their organization. Somebody has to work on the larger culture called the world or the city or the county or the state or the country. But if nobody works on it, it just kind of goes to seed, does it not?
It does, or it just gets influenced by people who believe different things about what's true, about what's good, about what's right. People who seek power over the common good, for example. And we've seen that throughout history. I mean, culture's not a static thing. You can't build it and leave it sit out there any more than you can just build a factory and expect that your corporate culture will be the same from day one to when, the paint's falling off the walls and no one's changing, the cakes in the urinals. I mean, you have to do all these little things because it's all part of the larger corporate culture that you have. And we all live in a very kind of a variety of levels of cultural realities, right? Our family cultures, our church cultures, our corporate cultures, our community cultures, and then of course the larger realities of what we might call Western culture, right? Which is very different today than it was 20 years ago, much less 50 years ago. Yeah. Some of these changes are good. Some of these changes are technological, but they're intentional. Right? I mean, there were ideas about the spread and the distribution of information that have changed what it means to live in Western culture. We just live in a different reality. Yeah. So yeah, we should care about it because it impacts us. But it's also, too, Greg, I would add this, we have to love our neighbors, right? That's the greatest command, is to love God. The second one is to love our neighbors as ourselves. If we love our neighbors, we have to love we have to love them enough to care about the world that they live in, right? And culture either, for example, takes care of the poor, the disenfranchised, the vulnerable, or it victimizes and exploits them. Yeah. And there are certainly individuals that do that, but then there are cultures that either notice them as human beings or don't notice them as human beings. So caring about culture is as tangible and practical as loving our neighbor.
I watched a chilling video the other day. The good news is I remember everything about it. The bad news is I don't remember what the organization was. So in any case, I think it was called Sing a Little Louder, and it was a train going down the tracks that broke down in Germany during the Hitler Auschwitz time. The train breaks down in front of a church where it's Sunday, and the pastor of the church gets everybody in the church congregation to just sing a little louder. And one little boy runs out and he sees the captured Jewish people being taken to the gas chamber, basically. And his mother comes out and tries to stop him from interacting with the Jewish people that are on the train. And the preacher guy is basically saying, let's all just sing a little louder. Is that happening today?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And part of it is one of the ways that modern culture has deeply infected all of us. Because the way modern culture, and there's a number of philosophical reasons for this, but the way modern culture treats religion as something that's personal, but also private. In other words, if you're a Christian, then that's your imaginary relationship with God. It's a self-help thing for you. But when you say things that have to do with religion or morality, you're not actually talking about the world. You're just talking about yourself. So faith is personal and it's private. And many Christians, and then, by the way, that's a philosophical framework called secularism. A lot of times we hear secular, we think atheist, but that's not true. Secularism doesn't disprove God. It just dismisses God. It privatizes God. And that's been very, very powerful. So we have our church life, and then we have everything else. What happens on Sunday, and then what happens every other time. Now, maybe what happens Sunday helps us develop a sense of meaning and purpose. It gives us a hope for after death, and maybe it helps us be a little bit more moral than we would be otherwise. But listen, if Christianity is true, if God did create the world, then that changes everything. C.S. Lewis said it was the most important statement of all time, because if it's true, everything's different. Mm-hmm. And but what happens is, when you treat religion and faith as personal and private, then something like a dramatically awful, horrific human rights abuse, you can dismiss as not having to do with me and Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or a culture that perpetually victimizes and exploits women, like we had in corporate America. I mean, watch Mad Men, right? How we had in corporate America for so long. Like, well, this is how business is done. And so we actually don't bring our faith to bear. But here's what we've seen, Greg, is that some of the most unbelievable people who have made the biggest difference in history have been Christians who believe that their faith actually revealed truth about the real world and meant that they had to actually do something. Some of them, by the way, were doing it through business and how they reimagined workers' rights, how they reimagined productivity, how they reimagined what the problem was, and therefore what the solution their company or their corporation was going to offer to it. These are amazing stories, but it requires being countercultural, at least in how we think about our faith.
Yeah, there are many stories. I wish I could remember them all right now, but yeah. It's a great study, all the Christian business leaders in the last 100 years who made
it's amazing.
Huge difference with their company. J.C. Penney is an example. A modern day person would be Truett Cathy, but there's many, 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 many others who have treated people with dignity and worth. I think it's Pitcairn Steel in Pittsburgh that really created the value of the person.
Oh, that's an amazing story. I just heard that this year, Greg. Yeah. And the thing in my role as president of the Colson Center, I obviously have to meet some of these people. I say I have to meet like it's a bad thing. I'm stunned. I mean, I really am stunned by the level that so many CEOs, CFOs, COOs, entrepreneurial kind of thinkers about the world, people that are just super creative, and how serious they are about, their faith. I'll tell you one story, and I won't name this guy's name because he doesn't want me to, but his business is really tied to the airline industry, which means it's not flying planes or anything like that, but he's really struggling. His business has taken a big old hit. And he sent us a gift, which was great. I didn't know how bad he was struggling, and I didn't ask him for it. He sent it, and he said, I want to talk to you about it. And I was like, sure. So I called him, and he said, I was reading George Mueller. If you know the story of George Mueller, he was one of the guys who was responsible for founding orphanages all up and down the colonies, and was known for praying and known for faith. And he has a part in one of his books where he says, I just talked to some friends who lost a lot, and they gave a gift then. And he said, why? And he said, because we don't deserve any of this. And so This is a thanks offering to God for not taking it all.
Oh, wow.
And that's what this guy said to me.
Wow.
And I was like, what a perspective. That you talk about a Christian worldview. That's getting it right at Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the world. This world belongs to God. Anything that I have is a gift from God. And that's how he lived with us. And I was just blown away because you know what? I'm supposed to do this stuff for a living, and I wouldn't have thought that way.
Wow.
I'm so amazed by these folks who are creative, innovative, and see it as a gift of God, as if God gifted them in order to gift to the world. Like they're a pass-through, a conduit of God's blessing. And when people, particularly business leaders, understand the power of how they think and what they believe in their faith. And maybe another thing we could say, Greg, is just how powerful it observably is right now when people who hold a different faith bring that faith to bear in the public square, right? So when people, for example, have certain deeply held beliefs about sexuality, progressive sexuality or something like that, you can look at the gay rights movement over the last several decades and think to yourself, when did it really start to change things in the American experience? There were really two moments in time. One, when it got deeply embedded, those ideas got deeply embedded in academic professionals, when it hit education. But second, and you can mark it on the calendar, it's 2014 in the state of Indiana, when business leaders brought that faith to bear and pressure on, at the time, Governor Pence on a religious freedom thing that they saw in conflict with LGBT rights. In other words, when the corporations became active according to their faith, it mobilized that movement at a whole new level.
Yeah, there's huge power in the corporate platform. Huge power.
Oh, look, go down the list. And when organizations like Human Rights Campaign or something figure out how to leverage that power, it is. And then you look and you say, well, throughout history, Christians have leveraged that sort of influence, and it's made an enormous difference. And now we see people of other faiths, leverage that same influence as well.
Yeah, yeah. There's an interesting story. I think it was up in Toronto, Canada, where people have been praying over a terrible place, a house that was just used for illicit sex, and the neighbors couldn't stop it, and the preachers couldn't stop it, and the prayers couldn't stop it, and it was going on. And this business came along and made the place an offer and bought the place, and they're not in business anymore. There's more than one way to do things.
Well, there's this old guy at my church in Tennessee who would look at something like that and go, "Hey, man, it ain't rocket surgery." It's like that just really kind of makes sense. And I've got a story about that as well, Greg, from two friends that both own their own business. One's very entrepreneurial and kind of corporate real estate, constantly acquiring portfolios, not even knowing all the land that he has. The other one being a corporate executive coach. And about 2 years ago, my friend who runs the real estate company found himself in having acquired a plot of land, and he hadn't even really known about it, but it was across the street from the largest Planned Parenthood clinic in the Midwest. They called it the super Walmart of Planned Parenthood because of the volume of abortions that they did. He only found out about it, by the way, when everyone started calling him going, "What are you going to do with this property? What are you going to do with this property?" He's like, "What property?" He's like, "That property." And, it was all part of this whole portfolio. And then a progressive state legislator called him and said, hey, you need to stop all those protests, because on this property was where Catholic groups and Protestant groups would go and pray, pray about unborn babies and so on, and do some of their protests. And when a Democratic senator called him, he realized that they're calling because, Planned Parenthood is a big donor in their pocket, and that's what happened. Well, look, I don't want to draw this out, but a long story short, local pregnancy resource center, their lease had run out. They were looking for a new property, and my friend just kind of got this vision. He called this group and said, "You're going to buy this and you're going to build it, and it's literally right across the street from the largest abortion clinic in all of central the Midwest." My other friend, who's a consultant, kind of a Deloitte level sort of business consultant, jumped in and helped them kind of brand it and architect it, because this Planned Parenthood clinic looks like a prison. It looks like a camp, right? It's awful. There's no windows. And so when they designed this pregnancy resource center to go across the street, it was big and it's life and it's light and so on and so on. Well, here's what's happened since the COVID-19. Planned Parenthood has had to narrow down its offering. So they've closed different centers and driven everybody into this main super Walmart, which apparently now is like a Sam's Club. And guess who's right across the street open? They have girls that think they're going to Planned Parenthood make the wrong turn because it's a more attractive building than the one across the street.
Oh, that's great.
And you know what? None of this would have happened unless God had equipped these two men. And I'm telling you, these are two brilliant guys. You might even know them if I said the name. They're brilliant, brilliant guys. They know what they're doing and they know it. They're really smart about it. And they've been blessed and they're blessing the world. It's really amazing.
Somebody has to have the money in order to pull those things off, right? I was talking
and the vision. I mean, there's a level of creativity there, right?
Totally.
We think of artists as being kind of visual artists or writers. Entrepreneurs and business leaders are artists. They see something that's not there and they put it there. And that's a way that God created us.
My daughter says I'm an idea artist.
That's really good, man. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. We were talking with Dr. Scott Ray, who I know you know, at Biola University the other day. And he kind of blew my mind where he said that Genesis passage that says, be fruitful and multiply. I always thought those two words went together, fruitful and multiply, and it has to do with the whole notion of procreation. Mm-hmm. He says, wait, no, that's not how it is. Fruitful is a word that talks about production and making things happen and producing and creating. And it really has economic underpinnings and it's not tied to multiply. So if we restated the Genesis passage, you should create things, do things, produce things, make things in culture. Oh, and you should multiply. But the first part creates things, which creates profit, which creates the money for people to do the story that you just told about the alternative center across the street from Planned Parenthood. So profit.
And God loves it. I think God loves it when his world is made better. I mean, if you look at that passage, this is before before the fall, before the curse, and God tells them to fill the earth, not just fill the garden. So you get this really kind of strong impression there that what they're supposed to do is God's given them this beautiful, flourishing, fruitful place. And now they're supposed to take that as a model and spread it out over the face of the earth. Right? Yeah. Which then makes a whole lot of sense why it's not good that man is alone, because that's a really big job description. But it is, it's a beautiful thing. I was on, but I'll tell you how many Christians miss this, Greg, and why it's so important. I was on a call just recently with a denomination, a group of clergy, 60 or 70 clergy in a Zoom webinar. And we were talking about kind of the cultural and worldview implications of COVID-19 for the church and all that. And they were talking about at this time, the number of medical professionals and so on that we see in depression, wanting to quit. It's a hard time to be a doctor. Now, if you were in Hurricane Harvey 4 years ago, it'd be a really hard time to be a first responder or a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, or a school teacher in Columbine, at Columbine High School. Or in other words, all of our jobs hit these times where it's just really awful to do these jobs. So there's not a bigger vision about what these jobs are about. And one of these pastors, don't lose your mind here on this one, but one of these pastors says, wait a minute, work wasn't in the garden, work was after the fall. And I said, no, that is just not true. Oopsie. Work is an inherent part of our God-given dignity. It's who we are. And when you can't work, and I think, Greg, we've seen this. I hate the use of this word non-essential that we're throwing around for workers. No work is non-essential. And I know what they mean. It's a way of categorizing. I just think language matters. I think we need to kick that language to the curb. Yeah. Work is essential to the human heart. Work is the way God made us. And when pastors could get that right, and talk about work as worship. And by the way, Scott Ray does it as well as anybody I know. I've learned half of my examples from Scott on this. I probably have stolen them from him, but it's going to be a whole lot easier for people to walk through those really difficult times in their occupational lives if they think the work that they do has meaning in the first place.
Right. And conversely, people who are sitting at home doing nothing because they're out of a job don't feel intrinsic value, dignity, and worth, not because they've watched too much Jeopardy, but because they are not producing anything. They're not creating anything. They're not making anything better. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah.
That produce word's huge. I mean, look, the fundamental difference between markets, a free market approach to economic reality and a more socialistic approach to the economy. This is why worldview matters right here.
Right.
It goes all the way fundamentally to that question, what's a human being?
Yes.
Socialist economies fundamentally treat human beings as consumers, which means the biggest problem you can have is too many humans. So that's why we have population control in India, in China. We have the reduced birth rate around the Western countries and so on, because the worst thing you can have in that system is too many eaters, essentially.
Yeah.
This is why, I mean, look, you take us to the extreme and you have the Nazis using phrases like useless eaters, right, as their justification to eliminate people.
Yeah.
The fundamental difference is in a market system, we tend to see people as consumers, but also producers.
Right.
And so it's amazing if you limit your perspective of reality, how much damage it can ultimately do.
Mm-hmm.
But when you see humans as not just the problem, but part of the solution, that's dignity, that's hope, there's just so many things that come out of that.
So if the culture is suppressing dignity and value and worth,
mm-hmm.
Talk to the CEO who's out there and says, well, I'm not trying to be, cute, but I see people as units of production who get things done for me. If they join the Rotary Club and are parents in the Little League, God bless them, but that's their own thing. I just want them to come to work and produce things. How would you reorient their thinking so they could see people differently?
Well, it's not a biblical way of thinking, and I'll say ultimately it won't work as well as treating people. See, when we say Christianity is true, what we mean is it's true with a capital T. I don't mean that I think it's true and somebody else doesn't, and so therefore it's true for me but not for you. What I mean is Christianity literally describes the world as it actually is. It best describes the contours of reality. Therefore, if you get the human condition right, you're going to have better results, because it's like if you deny gravity, you might be convinced of it, but the results aren't going to be good for you, right? What we started naming these people through history who started making these changes and living as Christians. That's one of the ways that they did it. They saw, a remarkable uptick in their productivity and the health of their workers and the long term. One can talk about, you mentioned David Green, when he adopted the Sabbath. First year he lost $1 million. The next year he became more successful than Michael's, who didn't honor the Sabbath. Why? I don't know. Why does Chick-Fil-A, who's closed on Sunday, do so well? Why is it that many people would rather, why is Chick-fil-A's franchise model so different than McDonald's franchise model? They're just based on a different vision. McDonald's sells you hamburgers. Chick-fil-A invests in people, and it's actually built into the franchise model itself. I used to study this, and I can't remember all the.
Well, once you're accepted to become a Chick-fil-A operator, the amount of money that you have to spend, I think, is still less than $10,000. It's absolutely ridiculously low. Why? The only reason is what Truett wanted in the first place. He wanted people to have an opportunity to do this role.
Yeah.
And if you are a good person who has all the characteristics of a leader, but you don't have enough money, not having the money should not be a blockade. So that's why it's so.
That's not and see what that is. It's an assumption that the most important thing this guy's bringing to the table is not his money.
Right.
It's his innovation, it's his dedication, it's his moral fiber, it's
Yeah.
all the other things that he's bringing.
Yeah.
And look, it doesn't always equal a better prophet, right? But it, I really appreciate what one of our ministry friends calls intentional inefficiencies. And it's, even as running a nonprofit like I do, it's helped me think through, here's an employee, on a purely productive level, I could save money by, changing them. And sometimes you got to do it because you're stewarding somebody else's giving, and like in my case. But there are intentional inefficiencies that you do, because they're the right thing to do. And at the end of the day, there's I think a different math that gets entered in. There's another couple factors, and it has to do with seeing the world beyond just the physical, beyond just profit motives.
Exactly.
And the fact of the matter is, Jesus was really clear, right? However we treat other people is how we're treating him. Paul calls him the second Adam. So there's this close connection throughout the scripture, and especially in Jesus's own words, that he's a representative of humanity. If I say I love my neighbor, but I hate, Jesus talks about all of these inconsistencies. If I say I love Jesus, but I treat my employees like a means to an end, then I treat Jesus like a means to an end, as opposed to an end themselves.
Well, John, I think you've helped us a lot when you boil some of these presenting issues down to the lowest common denominator when you say it's about truth with a capital T. If a business leader doesn't believe the Bible is an accurate historical document in which Jesus was named as the Son of the Creator God, then you might act differently Monday to Friday because it's probably just my little system. I probably, don't want to get in the way of the other guy who has a different religious system. I don't want to hurt his feelings. My thing might not be really true. It's just good for me. And then you make decisions that are poor.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right. I mean, this is why your worldview matters. I mean, if you went up to most people on the street and said, "What's your worldview?" they look at you strangely. But if you start asking them questions like, what's right and wrong, and who makes the rules, and what happens when you die, this framework that we have of our most basic beliefs become the grounding of our values, and from our values we make decisions. And so that's why it's essential that we start by asking these big worldview questions and say, well, okay, what is true? And from those true, what are the values that I should have? And from those values, how then should I live, right? What happens for most of us is that we live in a culture where certain behaviors are just taken for granted as normal. And so we just do what everybody else does. And when we don't think about what we believe, our behavior then turns around and reshapes our values, and our values turn around and reshape our deeply held beliefs. So in other words, many people live upside down, and it's really easy to do that today. So if you aren't intentional about your faith, about your worldview, you'll have a worldview. It'll just be more of one of my friends calls it a world, WHIRLD, right? Like a worldview, like a big buffet mixing, melting pot of really weird beliefs. And it'd be hard to be consistent and to honor God and to love our neighbor well.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears for a second. I know you've spent a lot of time with young leaders in some of your former work. What would you say are, maybe let's just do the top issue that a CEO should be concerned about if they have teenage kids at home and they might not know such and such? What would it be that they should pay attention to?
My good friend Brett Kunkel and I put a book out on this called A Practical Guide to Culture. And we talk about culture as water. And, you're in California, so I'll use this beach analogy. If you get hit by a wave on the beach, you know it. But we've also, especially those of us, that are not as used to the beach, we can find ourselves, just kind of having fun swimming in the water. We look up and suddenly we're 30 yards down the beach and we don't know how we got there. It's happened to all of us, right? And it wasn't a wave, it was a undercurrent. And one of the things I tell parents and grandparents all the time is that the waves you feel, you see, they hit you. but undercurrents you don't. These are dramatic shifts in the landscape that oftentimes, by the way, cause the waves. So I think what we often say is the most powerful part of our culture are not kind of the loud crashing waves. It's these unnoticed undercurrents that move us from, part A to part B, or point A to point B. So for example, we talked earlier about the need for truth. That's one of the reasons, is because living in the information age means a whole lot has changed, right? Thomas Friedman wrote the book, The World is Flat. Remember that book?
Uh-huh.
In which he argued that the internet was making everything, changing out, remaking the world, flattening out the differences between the haves and the have-nots, and developing nations and developed nations. He wrote that book in 2006. His next book, by the way, the first chapter is entitled, What Happened in 2007? You know what happened in 2007 was the iPhone, the Android, Skype, Twitter. Moore's Law went from 2 years to 18 months. I mean, 2007 is like the year of the printing press and in the information age. And what his point is like, look, I wrote about the world is flat the year before was the most important year in this whole computer revolution. Our kids have never known a different world than that. We're immigrants to iPhones, right? They're natives. We're immigrants to glowing rectangle devices everywhere. They're natives. Now, I know we know that. And we think that the big change is I got to get, proficient on Zoom or something like that. Well, yeah, but a world in which a world of the information age is a world where kids have access to ideas at an unprecedented rate. And they have access to these ideas before they've developed discernment about these ideas.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, and this is
totally.
It's really important. I mean, look, I grew up in a Christian home. I never met a Buddhist. Our kids have read Buddhist ideas or have seen them in movies, television shows, or whatever from day one. We live we're just bombarded with these ideas and doing it at a time before they have a really developed sense of discernment.
Yeah.
So that's a big one.
Can we pick on an issue for a second, and at the risk of getting all kinds of hate mail, but to keep it practical. So I have some friends, we all have friends that this has happened to, where the family picture comes out and the girls' dresses are very different than they were 50 years ago. And it's now okay to show certain parts of a woman's body on a normal photography shot than it was 50 years ago. I was at the beach the other day, yes, when it opened legitimately in California. And there were probably, 30-40% of the women who their beach wear left nothing to the imagination. Mm-hmm. So how did that happen from 75 years ago when women wore dresses to the beach? How did that happen?
Well, that's another trend that we talk about in the book, and that trend has a lot more to do with our loss of identity. In fact, I think one of the most if you kind of think about all the issues we have, from fashion to sex trafficking, from what it means to be an educated person to how to deal with poverty, at the root of answering all these questions requires that we know what it means to be human. There's a profound truth in the Psalms where David is writing about why we ought to praise God, and he compares God to the idols. It's in Psalm 135, and you should check it out. But somewhere around verse 15, he goes, the idols are deaf and they're dumb. They can't speak. They can't hear. They're not alive. And then he says in verse 18, those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. Here's the theological thought. We're made in the image of God. If we want to know who we are, we don't start by looking at each other. We have to start by looking at God. The counterpoint is, what if we become a culture that no longer looks at God? Then we become a culture that no longer knows what it means to be human. And when we don't know what it means to be human anymore, we have to make up things that make us feel good about ourselves or that give us a sense of stable identity. And look, the sexual revolution has been the dominating force that has come in as the replacement theology, so to speak, for human value, that our human value is based on our sexual orientation or our sexual identity. But it's created a really difficult thing. I mean, Greg, it was just 3 years ago when the Me Too movement started, right? The hashtag Me Too movement.
Right.
Which has uncovered in a very difficult, painful, and not a perfect way, really bad things that have happened to women in various parts of society. It was started, of course, around exposing Harvey Weinstein, which, of course, everyone knew about in Hollywood for decades.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if you remember this. This is the bizarre thing. So Harvey Weinstein gets thrown under the bus, rightfully so, by the way. I mean, no defense of him whatsoever. But 3 weeks before that, the whole world was remembering with fondness and even celebration Hugh Hefner, who had passed away. Is there a greater exploiter of women's bodies in our lifetime than Hugh Hefner?
Probably not.
So this is where all this leads. It's like we untethered human dignity from God and we tethered it to midair, you know? And so suddenly Hugh Hefner's a good guy, but Harvey Weinstein is a bad guy. And who makes that decision? And how are you supposed to keep up with it? And you see what I mean? It's just impossible to do it, but it happens because of this. So for example, we're not supposed to exploit women's bodies. And yet that's where the fashion trend for swimwear goes. How do you hold that together? Sex trafficking is the worst crime on the planet. Everyone agrees to that. You shouldn't sexualize young girls. The swimwear for young girls is worse than the swimwear for grown women.
Huh.
Right? So it's just left this part of confusion where a culture lands if you don't have solid ground of truth with a capital T.
Mention your book again, because there's some people listening who should buy it, the one you did with Brent.
Yeah. It's called A Practical Guide to Culture. And we really wrote it because we felt like the generation gaps between Gen Z and millennials, and then from boomers, was dramatic. And you know what's interesting, Greg, too, is one of the groups of people that have so resonated with that book. I've spoken to and in fact, last year I spoke to 1,000 grandparents. I'm like, I'm not a grandparent. Why am I speaking to? But I think grandparents really feel that generation gap between them and their grandkids.
Yeah.
And as I often say, it's three things, right? It's sex, it's technology, and it's Trump. Those three things are huge generation gaps. And so grandparents struggle to know really what it is and how to communicate it. And the book has been helpful for that group, which we're really grateful for.
Yeah, I strangely have some gray hair these days, and I was at the grandparenting seminar at EV Free.
Oh, yeah.
Fullerton, and Josh McDowell got up, and I talked to him a little bit before, and he said, you know, you're not going to believe what I'm going to say, kind of thing. And I was like, I know you're going to say something pretty big, and that's how Josh rolls.
Yeah,
and
that's how he does it.
Basically said to 2,000 grandparents gathered in EV Free Fullerton, you need to pay attention to what your grandchildren are doing with their phone while they're at Grammy and Grampy's house for a sleepover. Because in about 3 seconds, they can be surfing pornography while they're having a sleepover at your house and you don't know it. So I love what you said about Psalm 135, the whole identity thing, the idols piece. That really reframes the discussion for the busy CEO who's maybe missing the point of the discussion. So, well, the fun thing about talking about things with you is I could talk for another 3 hours, but we're kind of out of time, and we'll have to either do this again or do it in real time when we're allowed to actually see each other again. But I'm so grateful that you've taken time to be with us here. Even though we're in different parts of the country. But I'm really grateful. If you want to connect with John, you can find him on Twitter at JB Stonestreet and on the web at breakpoint.org. John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center, thank you so much for spending time with us at Convene. I'm very grateful.
Hey, Greg, I love what you guys are doing at Convene. I love the vision of an integrated life between church and work and family, and that we're all living this for the Lordship of Christ that you guys champion in both really solid theological as well as really practical ways. So Godspeed to you guys. Love what you do.
Thanks, John.